Well, hello everyone. Hello. Nice to see you in person. Yes. I'm John Henry, I'm the director here, and it's a pleasure to welcome you tonight to our Sheppy Dog Fund lecture presentation. Tonight we have Dr. Gary Rendsburg back with us, this time in person. His presentation is The World of the Cairo Geniza. Some of you may remember that he gave a virtual Sheppy Dog Fund lecture last July on the greatest Bible ever written, which is, by the way, is still available to watch, and you can find the link on our website under past lectures. In fact, you can find all of our lectures on that same site, so if you missed some, you can look them up there. The Sheppy Dog Fund Lecture Series was established in 2012. I know some of you were even at the first lectures, how time flies, by Dr. Alan Klein to address the topics of art, religion, and history prior to the 19th century. Alan is with us, and we can give him a warm thank you. Alan, we really appreciate how this lecture series has developed. It's really a special thing that we can offer the community. Thank you very much. And I also want to thank the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation for their continued support of the FIA. They make a lot of things possible here. And of course, I want to thank the citizens of Genesee County for the Genesee County Arts, Education, and Cultural Enrichment Millage, which provides free entry to the FIA for all Genesee County citizens. Now, please take a moment and join me in silencing your noisemakers. Thank you. Dr. Rendsburg serves as the Blanche and Irving Laurie Professor of Jewish History in the Department of Jewish Studies at Rutgers University. He has a PhD and an MA from NYU. He is the author of 7 books and over 90 articles now. Over 190 articles. So let's give a warm welcome to Dr. Gary Rendsburg. Let me get this out of your way.
Thank you very much, John, and good evening, everyone. It is such a pleasure to be here in Flint. Last year's experience via Zoom was absolutely wonderful, but there's nothing like in-person lecturing, and it's so good to meet so many people, both staff members here at the FIA and some of you whom I've had an opportunity to meet as you came in as well. Thanks to the entire staff, John, Tracy, Lori, you know who you are. There's so many moving parts to a program such as this, so I want to thank all the staff members, and again, a special thanks to Alan Klein for sponsoring the lecture series and for inviting me here to Flint to share with you the world of the Cairo Geniza from Cordoba to Cardamon. We all like alliteration. You'll see as we proceed what each of those is all about. Okay, what is the Cairo Geniza? This is the Ben Ezra Synagogue in Cairo, actually in the older part of Cairo known as Fustat. It's a few miles south of modern-day downtown central Cairo. And it is a synagogue that was built around the year 900. Yes, you're looking at a building that is 1,100 years plus old, approximately. It has been renovated several times, including at the end of the 19th century, which I'll show you. And but the bones of the building, the original structure, is more or less what you're seeing here. So there's the year it was founded. There is some debate as to exactly the year it was founded, but approximately end of the 9th century. Its most illustrious congregant slash leader was the famous Moses Maimonides, the greatest sage in the history of Judaism, who was born in Cordoba, southern Spain, moves to Egypt through Morocco to Egypt, and lives there for the rest of his life until he dies in the year 1204. 1170 is the approximate year he arrives in Egypt as a younger man. The interior, as I said, was renovated, and the synagogue continued in use until the 1950s. It was a living, operating synagogue of the Cairo Jewish community, one of a dozen or more synagogues operating in Cairo, which had a very robust Jewish community until the 1950s and 60s. It was conserved. It still belongs to the Jewish community, as I'll show you. It was conserved by the Bronfman Foundation, which provided the funds to really make it the showplace that it is today. And if you're not aware of this, Edgar Bronfman, the chairman of Seagram's and the chairman of the Bronfman Foundation, now deceased, his sister Phyllis is an architectural historian. So she took a special interest in the project. And here we are in the interior. So in the 1890s, when the synagogue is being renovated, it is electrified at that point, as you can see, and no expense was spared. So it gets gold gilding, it gets marble pillars and a marble reader's table and so on. And it is just a remarkable structure. Show of hands, how many people have been to the Ben Ezra Synagogue in Cairo? Oh, several of you, good, okay. Surprise, field trip tomorrow, we'll all go there together, okay. So you get a sense of what this looks like. Okay, absolutely beautiful. The reader's table here and the ark, which holds the scrolls of the Torah at the front of the building. Now, you probably can see there's a balcony. And in traditional Jewish style, and also true of other religious traditions, men and women sit separately. Women are in the upper gallery, and you see the balcony there. If you look up here, this is the ark again. This is the front of the building. You enter at the back, but this is the front. There's an opening in the wall, and this is it, okay? Not everything I just showed you are not my photos. This is still one of my photos. I still love showing the photos that I took, 20 years ago when I visited the place. Now, what is a Geniza, or its Hebrew pronunciation, Geniza? It means storeroom. In Jewish tradition, one cannot simply dispose of sacred texts, scrolls of Torah, Bibles, prayer books, special prayer books for the high holidays and the other festivals, the Passover Haggadah read at the Seder on Passover. All of those texts have a sanctity to them, obviously the biblical manuscripts, but the others as well. And one doesn't simply just put them in the rubbish heap or nowadays in the recycling bin. They have to be treated with the utmost respect. Over time, certain documents become unusable, illegible, pages are torn. We all know this from our own experience, even our own personal libraries. Do that for hundreds of years and so on. And in most Jewish communities, such documents are taken to the cemetery, which is still the case today in Jewish communities. And that was also done in Cairo, though to a lesser extent. For reasons that we still don't know, the practice of this Jewish community was simply to take all of its documents and put them in that storeroom that you see there. And they did this for hundreds of years. In fact, we have documentation from that storeroom over the course of about a millennium. Even into the 19th century, they were still depositing their documents there. There's a diorama of what it looks like. It's accessible only by a ladder. I regret that when I was there, I did not ask for a ladder to climb up and have a look at it. A colleague of mine did, and I'll show you a photo in a little bit. But I plan to be back in Cairo in October. This time I will definitely ask for a ladder to have my own look. So this is a diorama of what it must have been like to deposit manuscripts there. And you see it's just a random pile getting fuller and fuller, or maybe you prefer the cartoon version. Either way, you get to see what this was like. Now, we fast forward from the Middle Ages, which is what my diorama and the cartoon were showing you, to the late 19th century. Starting in the 1860s already, 1870s, 1880s, scholars would visit Egypt. This was the great age of discovery. European scholars going to the Middle East, looking for antiquities, the great pharaonic antiquities of the museums that we have visited in our lives, ditto going over to Iraq, lesser excavations in Israel, Jordan, etc., only because those civilizations in antiquity were not as advanced as ancient Egypt or ancient Mesopotamia. And word had reached scholars in Europe of various ancient Jewish documents, not as old as the time of the pharaohs, obviously, but sufficiently old from the Middle Ages. And there's a trickle of this material going to places like Oxford and Paris and you name it. The story then changes in the year 1896. Let me introduce you to these two remarkable twin sisters, Scottish Presbyterians, Agnes Lewis and Margaret Gibson. Their father was a Presbyterian minister in Scotland. These were his two children, and he gave them a good classical 19th century Victorian education. What does that mean? That doesn't mean a little bit of French and a little bit of this and a little bit of that. I'm talking they mastered Greek, Latin, Hebrew, and Aramaic, because that's what you did in the 19th century if you were smart, okay? And these women did so as well. They both marry, Mrs. Lewis and Mrs. Gibson. Both of their wealthy men, both of their husbands died young, and they inherited the fortune from their two husbands, which their relatively moderately paid Presbyterian minister in Scotland, of course, didn't have that kind of funds. And they used their funds and their education to start to travel the world, meaning the world of the Mediterranean and the Middle East, and to see what they can discover. By this point, they've also moved to Cambridge, which is the great university center. Women were just beginning to be admitted into Cambridge University colleges, but they did not get admitted. They had their own sort of education that they didn't need. And what they didn't know, they learned then on their own. They go to Egypt in 1895 and again in 1896 on several journeys with the goal of going to St. Catherine's Monastery in the southern end of the Sinai Desert. It is remote, which is an understatement, as I'll show you in a few minutes on the map. And there they begin to study the manuscripts that are housed in this Greek Orthodox monastery, in Greek and in Syriac, which is a Christian dialect of Aramaic. And by the way, they take with them photographic material. They were pioneers. Mrs. Lewis and Mrs. Gibson are heroes in my world. They took with them early photographic equipment, and those metal plates are actually back in storage in the Cambridge University Library down to the present day. By the way, this is the, how do you get into this monastery? I don't know if there are people. Yeah, there are. Do you see people here? Do you see the size of these monastery walls? And how does one get into the monastery? This is a basket that gets lowered like an elevator. This is a basket that gets lowered on the exterior walls. You get in it and they pull it up and you climb over the wall. I think today there's a more proper entrance. But this is how Mrs. Lewis and Mrs. Gibson did this. And here's the location of it. What are the logistics of such a journey? You take a boat to Alexandria, a ship to Alexandria. You go overland to Cairo. And in Cairo, you hire a group of Bedouin who will take you on the trek through the desert on camels, 11-day trek. This is what these women did in the 19th century, and they go to St. Catherine's. In fact, they did it twice, okay? Carrying all of that equipment, their food, their water, their photographic equipment, their books, everything they need. And they, as I said, are pioneers in the field. 19th century Victorian women. I mean, these are like the little-known facts of history. Their story has now been told by Janet Soskis, who actually just left Cambridge and is now teaching at Duke University, about their journeys. And there you have it, great story. When they're on their way back in 1896, when they're on their way back to England, in Cairo, they pick up some of these manuscripts that were coming out of the synagogue's storeroom. Because they're interested in that material too. They're interested in everything. and they bring it back to Cambridge, and there they share their discoveries with Professor Solomon Schechter. Who is he? He was the greatest scholar of Jewish everything in late 19th, early 20th century. Born in Romania, educated in Vienna and Berlin, he makes his way to England, first to London, and then he gets appointed as reader in Hebrew at the University of Cambridge. It was very unusual for a Jewish person to be able to gain an academic position in either Oxford or Cambridge at this time. And he serves there, and then eventually, as you see at the bottom, comes to New York to be the president of the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, where he remains until he dies in the year 1915. Mrs. Lewis and Mrs. Gibson are friends with Solomon Schechter. By the way, we haven't even shown you a single document yet. This is all the story, right? The story of discovery is so remarkable, and Schechter's role, as I'll show you, and the story and the role of Lewis and Gibson. They had become friends with one another and colleagues. Why? For the following reason. Oxford and Cambridge, all of the colleges then, and still today, are officially all Anglican church institutions. They are all members of the Church of England. They all have chapels. And this is what it was like to be part of that society. If you were not part of the Church of England, if you were then on the social margins, you could be a Jewish professor, the world-famous Jewish professor, but you didn't take part in chapel and everything else. You could be Scottish Presbyterian women who would be twice on the social margins, right? They're not Anglicans, they're not even English, they're Presbyterians, they're Scottish, they're women. And these people find one another, and therefore the Schechter and the two women had become already friends. They show that Mrs. Lewis and Mrs. Gibson are going through the documents they obtained. Bible, this, that. They're able to identify almost everything. There's one document they could not identify, and this is it. They show it, I know it's a little dark, but they show it to, it is legible. They show it to Solomon Schechter. They figure, well, we don't know what it is, but at least Professor Schechter will know what it is. They take it to him, and he realizes that what he's holding in his hands is the Hebrew original of the Book of Ben Sira, known in the Greek Orthodox tradition as Sirach, and in the Latin Roman Catholic tradition as Ecclesiasticus. What is this book? It's a book that was written in the 2nd century BCE in Hebrew. The grandson of the author, whom we call Ben Sira, translated the book into Greek, and then that becomes part of the Greek Christian Bible. It's a Jewish composition, but it becomes part of the Greek Christian Bible, the Latin Catholic Bible, etc. And it was never canonized in the Jewish tradition, and therefore it was lost. It's a piece of Jewish literature that you could study if you were a scholar of Jewish texts in Greek or Latin translation, but it was, the Hebrew original was lost. It's actually quoted a few times in the Talmud, which is to say a line here or a line there, which is to say that in the heyday of the rabbinic compositions, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th century CE, it was known still, and so we knew that Jews were still reading it, and in fact, one later 10th century commentator actually quotes it as well, but otherwise it's lost. Schechter identified it. Now, do you understand what this means? He knew the Greek translation so well that when he was shown the Hebrew text, he said, oh, that's the Hebrew original of Ben Sira. Let me put this into perspective, okay? 2,000 years from now, the poetry of Walt Whitman is lost, but it still exists in, let's say, French translation, right? And you show and then somebody discovers an actual, pun intended, leaf of the leaves of grass, and says, I found this in an old, who knows where, okay, in the archives at the Flint Institute of Art, okay, and, or the library across the way, and somebody says, oh, that's the original that's the English original of Walt Whitman, right? That was the genius of Schechter. I have a colleague in Cambridge who says, correctly, that Schechter was probably the only person in the world, this is not an exaggeration, who, if shown this document, would be able to identify what it was. He writes a letter to Mrs. Lewis. I think we have reason to congratulate ourselves. You see how fast he's writing? You just see the ink pouring out of his inkwell in his pen, right? For the fragment I took with me represents a piece of the original Hebrew of Ecclesiasticus. It is the first time that such a thing has been discovered. Please do not speak yet aloud about the matter till tomorrow. I will come to you tomorrow about 11 p.m. and talk over the matter with you, how to make the matter known. In haste and great excitement, yours sincerely, S. Schechter. We all think that the 11 p.m. is a mistake. You don't go calling on Victorian women at 11 p.m., right? It was probably 11 a.m., but in his haste and excitement, he got the times all confused and so on. And this letter is still preserved, and it's in the archives in Cambridge. Schechter knows that he has to go to Cairo now, right? He's known about these little pieces of information that are coming out of Cairo because a colleague over in Oxford's publishing some of it, and a colleague in London and Paris. They're all publishing bits and pieces. But he said, if this treasure's there, imagine what else is there, and he wants to go to Cairo. Schechter turns to his friend and colleague, Charles Taylor. Charles Taylor is the master of St. John's College. It is the wealthiest college of the constituent colleges in Cambridge. He is a Hebraist and a classicist and happens to be the master of the college with funds at his disposal. There he is in all his regalia. He is an Anglican ordained priest. That very year, by the way, he was coming out with the second edition of one of the classical Hebrew texts called the Sayings of the Fathers, or Pirkei Avot, and it says 1897. That's the second edition. So he's working on the same kind of stuff that Schechter is. And by the way, this is St. John's College. Not a bad gig to be the master of St. John's. And he supplies Schechter with all the funds you need. One of my other colleagues in Cambridge says, can you imagine if he had to go to the committee and apply for a research grant? I mean, it would have taken years and years and years of paperwork and so on. And he gets the funds. And he goes off to Cairo, and there he ingratiates himself in a very positive way to the rabbi of the community, who says to him, basically, take whatever you would like. You don't even have to pay for it. Obviously, he needed funds for the transportation and all that, and his own ship passage. Schechter empties out what was still there in that storeroom. This is what it looked like. Today in Cambridge, they actually keep a single box of uncatalogued stuff so that you can get a sense of what it was like when Schechter peered in and saw the material. And he writes in his memoir, it is a battlefield of books, etc., and actually invokes the Gary Rendsburg School of Scholarship. He refers to it as the disjecta membra strewn all over the area. As my students know, never say it in English if you can say it in Latin or German. Okay. And there you see it. Okay. Obviously, they know what's there, but there's nothing that's precious. I mean, it's precious in the sense that it's all sacred text, but it's not like there's another, leaf of the Book of Ben Sira in that pile. Okay. This is what it looks like today. As I told you, a colleague took a photo, got up on a ladder, and looked in there, and this is the emptied storeroom. Schechter arranges with the British consul in Egypt for all the documents to be taken to the port of Alexandria, loaded on a ship, headed to Liverpool, and you see my arrow in the bottom right. He wires his wife in Cambridge and tells her to meet the ship in Liverpool, please, and make sure that the stuff gets transported to Cambridge. I'm going off to Israel to go see my brother, whom I haven't seen in 20 years since we left Romania. I went off to Vienna and so on. He moved to Israel. So I can't imagine that, I guess he just took it for granted that the stuff would reach. I wouldn't have let it out of my sight. But anyway, he makes his way back to England as well. And this is the iconic picture of Schechter in the Cambridge University Library, where they gave him space to start to work on this. Do you see the crates, right? And he does the basic cataloging. I'm going to give you technical terms within the Jewish tradition. If you know these texts, fine. Bible over here. Mishnah over here. Talmud of the land of Israel over here, Talmud of Babylonia over there, prayer book over here, Maimonides goes over there, liturgical poetry goes over there. He's doing just basic I said cataloging. It's not cataloging, it's sorting, okay? And of course, he doesn't have to look everything up because he knows every text that he finds, okay? I mean, that's the genius of the man, okay? This is the building. This was the old library building. It's now used for administration because in the 1930s, they built a new building, which is in use today, Cambridge University Library. And if you entered there today, this is the storeroom of the documentation, and everything has a TS label, TS Taylor Schechter. And the thinner ones are here. I didn't give you the number yet. 200,000 documents, okay? 200,000 documents. The grand total is 300,000 documents, 100,000 of them in other locations, 200,000 of them the mother lode in Cambridge, all organized like this and like this. So I, as a researcher, I go to Cambridge about every other summer, pre-COVID times, to work on documents. I was there in 2019, for example, you know, they call the documents that I would like to see. So this is how it started, and I just showed you how it's all organized today. So this is where the documents are. The majority, the 2/3 of them in Cambridge, other large collections in New York, Oxford, Manchester, St. Petersburg, Russia, and Philadelphia, and then in about 70 other locations around the world. But, you know, the other locations have, you know, 20 here and 300 there or something like that. If you add that up, you're already, you know, close to the 300,000 documents. These are the centers of Geniza research. JTS in New York, by the way, Schechter didn't bring anything from Cambridge with him. Their collection has nothing to do with Schechter. They obtained documents from a private collector later on during the 1920s. That's how they built their collection. Okay, that's the story. What's in the Geniza? What are these documents? What do they reveal? Everything you would expect to find, and I just went through a long list, is there. We'll start with Bible. The oldest material we have in the Jewish tradition is Bible. And Bible comes in two forms. Scrolls of the Torah, which are read in the synagogue down to the present day. The scroll format still has to be used. And what's called the Codex, which is the forerunner of the book, handwritten, but you write on both sides and you turn pages as opposed to scrolling. By the time of the Middle Ages, the Codex has taken hold as the preferred way of creating the physical properties of a book, but the scrolls are still very much in use in the synagogue. This is one of the oldest scrolls, about 800 CE. This is older than the synagogue itself, which is to say when the synagogue was built, they brought into the synagogue scrolls which were probably in the other building that they had been using up until that point. This might even be 700 CE. Still haven't done a carbon-14 test on this. Some of the other documents have had a carbon-14 test, so we have a good sense. And here I am actually in the library in 2019 reading that very text, okay? So you can see it here, the professional digital image. And you can view these on your computer screen, as I'll show you at the end, but there's nothing like actually reading these things. They're all preserved under these plastic mylar things, whatever they make them out of. And there's the back of it, just to show you that it is empty, because it's a scroll. There's nothing on the back. If you can read Hebrew, there's just 3 lines blown up for you. You can still read this, right? Good parchment and good ink preserves for more than 1,000 years, especially in the dry climate of Egypt. And another fragment from the same scroll, by the way. The image may not look exactly the same. That's because different imaging happens in the course of going through the collection, but they actually do match up and are part of the same scroll. You see a very large margin at above the lines there. Okay. Other Bible manuscripts in the form of the Codex, just sample pages of what Bible manuscripts look like. Very well-written book of Samuel. By the way, not just the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, but all these other biblical books that are in the Jewish canon. another Book of Samuel manuscript. The Mishnah is the earliest text of rabbinic literature in the post-biblical period. It's a collection or a codification of Jewish law done by the rabbis circa 200 CE. And so, of course, we have hundreds of fragmentary copies of that as well. This is a particular tractate that deals with the laws of the Sabbath. The Talmud of the land of Israel, it's the less studied one and the less complete of the two Talmud texts. Nicely written. I'm only showing you one sample of each. Talmud of the land of Babylonia, and this one actually happens to be at Columbia University in the U.S. It's one of those other institutions which has a much smaller collection, but it's a really well-preserved copy done by a professional scribe, so I like to show it. And then, as I mentioned, the Passover Haggadah. So Passover is about a month away from today. And so this is the text that Jews recite at the Seder table on the holiday of Passover. It's a collection of biblical verses dealing with the Exodus from Egypt and rabbinic commentary thereon and so on. Haggadah means telling or narration. This is the oldest Passover Haggadah we have, full stop. We have medieval copies from the 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th centuries. Obviously, we have early printed books once you get the age of printing. And today, of course, you have all sorts of beautiful Passover Haggadah texts at the Seder table. This is the oldest one. I tell this to my students, and I want to highlight it for you as well. If you can read Hebrew, or if you cannot read Hebrew, I hope you can recognize what's going on with this text. Compare it to this. And you heard me say a moment ago, this is done by a professional scribe. This is not. Does everybody just see that this is almost like scribble, even if you can't read Hebrew? We assume that a head of household borrowed a copy from a neighbor, or maybe if there was one in the synagogue, got some paper. By the way, paper is still relatively new in the world, at least in the Middle East at this point. Good text you want to write on parchment, but more ephemeral stuff is going to be written on paper. I think this one's on paper, which would have been easier for an individual to own as opposed to a scribe, or to obtain. In any case, he just writes it out, okay, by hand, really quickly. Today, if you're at a Passover Seder, everybody has the printed book, and you go around the table, and everybody can read a portion and so on, right? In the Middle Ages, you were lucky if there was one copy at the table, and almost undoubtedly it was the head of household who just read the entire text. And so here's more of it. If you can read Hebrew, Ma nishtana halayla hazeh mikol halelot. How is this night different from all other nights? One of the key passages in the Seder. You still read it today, 1,100 years later. By the way, the text is much, much shorter. It had the Middle Ages, with the passing of the centuries, there was an accretion of all sorts of other materials, a much shorter text than the one that is typically used in Jewish households today. It's in Philadelphia, as you see. The document that Schechter identified as the Book of Ben Sira was the first of the Ben Sira documents to be found. But in the end, many, many more documents were found. From the same manuscript that Schechter found, he found more of them in Cairo when he went there, additional manuscripts, and some that were already actually in Oxford before Schechter got to Cairo, and some that wound up in New York, and so on and so forth. So all told, we have 6 medieval manuscripts of the Book of Ben Sira from the Cairo Geniza. Some of them multiple folios. A folio was a page written on 2 sides. And some of them represented by only a single folio. Wish we had more, but that's all we have. If you want to study these, you'd have to go to the library collections in New York, Oxford, Cambridge, London, Paris, Manchester. That would be a lot of work. Welcome to the digital age. This is my website. One of my Rutgers honor students and I, about 7 years ago, 8 years ago now, I think, created bensira.org, where we have digitally reunited all of the manuscripts just by clicking the mouse. The documents from the same manuscript wound up in various library collections, right? So you don't have to now travel. Well, you still should travel to Paris and London, of course, but you can actually just do it from the leisure of your home, thanks to Gary Rendsburg and my student Jacob Binstein. And that's the home page, and you all know what you're looking at. The letter Schechter wrote to the twins, the original document over there, and if you clicked on the big button there, View the Manuscript, you would be able to view them all. Zoom in, we have transcriptions of the Hebrew, we have translations, we've got everything you would ever need. Okay, that's the book of Ben Sira, just to remind you that there was a lot more of that. Then there's stuff that's not quite sacred. A wedding contract. We have lots of wedding contracts, known in Hebrew as ketubah. Again, if you can't read Hebrew, whether you can or cannot, this is all very lovely, nicely written by a scribe. And at the bottom, not as well written, are all the signatures of the witnesses. Technically, you only need 2 witnesses in a Jewish wedding, but there's typically more witnesses signing the document. And another example of such. Again, a very well-written one. This relates to there were 2 different Jewish communities, actually. The one that followed the rabbinic system, called the Rabbinite community, and another community called the Karaite community. We learned that the peoples actually would intermarry one another from this and many, many other such ketubot, marriage contracts between the 2 branches of the Jewish community in medieval Cairo. And in the interest of time, I think we'll just go a little bit fast forward through this, but this is my translation of a good portion of the text. This one's in Oxford at the Bodleian Library. And then there's stuff that's clearly not in any which way sacred. And that's like an example would be this trousseau list of a wealthy bride. Okay, this is in Cambridge. It's just a long list of everything that she owns, okay, that she brought into the marriage. And I know you're not going to be able to read this, but I've given you a translation here of everything. I didn't produce this. A colleague that worked on this. We all have our little expertise, okay? My expertise is the biblical manuscripts from the Cairo Geniza, and then there are others who work on the other material. So these are all the things that she brings in, including clothing. And by the way, this is written, let me now say a word about this. This is written, it's Hebrew lettering, but this is Arabic language. This is what we call Judeo-Arabic. These people spoke Arabic. It's the language of the land. They thought in Arabic. They spoke Arabic at home. They spoke Arabic in the marketplace. They did everything in Arabic. The only thing they used Hebrew for would have been their sacred text, reading the Bible, liturgy, and so on. But when they wrote Arabic, they preferred to write it in the Hebrew alphabet because they just were more capable of writing it, apparently. The educated people certainly could read the Arabic as well, written in Arabic. So I'm mentioning that because there are lots of words here that I've just given in italics where we don't know what they actually mean, and people have worked on them. I mean, these are rare words in Arabic. They must have been very common in medieval Egyptian Arabic. And it just goes on and on and on. Why did that wind up? First of all, why the document? A wealthy woman would bring her trousseau into the marriage. If she got divorced, it returns to her according to Jewish law. So she had to keep a record. But how did it wind up in the Geniza, and why? One answer is, we don't know. And the other answer is, we hypothesize the following. A generation or 2 goes by, and everybody's going through grandma's stuff and grandpa's stuff, or Uncle Saul's stuff, or Uncle Joe's stuff. And we've all emptied out the homes of our loved ones who've passed away. And we're not going to sort through it. We just, there's a Bible manuscript and this and that. We just take the whole thing and we put it in the storeroom, in the Geniza, without sorting it and figuring out what's required to be treated respectfully and what could be disposed of. That's the theory as to how this material, which is about 1/10 of the 300,000 documents, about 30,000 of them are these kinds of things, which are phenomenal for reconstructing the lives of ordinary people in medieval Cairo. Okay. You're so modern with your prenups, aren't you? Okay, well, they already existed 1,000 years ago, okay? We got prenuptial agreements. Some guy had to agree to all sorts of things before his wife would marry him, okay? Alphabet primer. If you learned Hebrew at some point in your life when you were 5 or 6 years old, you probably learned it something that looks just like this 1,000 years later. The Jews of Cairo were an important community, and they were nested within the larger community. The Muslim rulers were known as the Fatimids. And the head of the Jewish community would be an appointee, technically, of the Fatimid Caliph. And so here is a letter, a draft, scribbled in Arabic, sent to the Caliph's court recommending such and such become the new head of the Jewish community, Solomon ben Judah. I'm sure the one that was sent to the court, to the royal court, was written beautifully in smooth handwriting, but this was a draft which somebody took down as dictation, wound up in the Geniza as well. The Bible, everything, whatever you want, you can find it amongst the 300,000 documents. The Bible transcribed into Arabic script. This is the opposite of Judeo-Arabic. This is Arabic writing, but if you were to read this aloud, it would be Hebrew. Who was this for? Maybe for a Muslim who converted to Judaism. We don't know. They don't come with, titles and captions, right? But who would need such a text? Perhaps a Muslim who converted to Judaism, who would go to synagogue, hadn't learned to read Hebrew yet, but could follow the reading aloud by following this text. Or the opposite. The Quran in Hebrew script. Who was this for? A Jew who had converted to Islam, perhaps, but hadn't yet learned to read Arabic. I mean, these are the questions that these texts raise. There's something here for everyone. And there's a specialist on all of these. Maimonides was the great scholar whom I mentioned earlier. He is the physician to the Sultan and the head of the Jewish community. We always had his texts because they were preserved by Jewish communities throughout the Mediterranean and into Europe. But now we have drafts of his work, including his signature, which is right here. We now know his handwriting so well. We have dozens of his handwritten drafts that even if he doesn't have his name on it, we know it's his because of the handwriting. Even I, a non-specialist, could identify Maimonides' handwriting by now. This is a draft of his Code of Jewish Law. This is a draft of his philosophical work called the Guide for the Perplexed, written in Judeo-Arabic. It was later translated into Hebrew. And you can see, he's doing cross-outs, and he's got marginal notes. The mind of the philosopher at work, right? Not the final version, but the mind of the philosopher at work. If anybody knows Arabic, I know there are certain people in the room who do. This is fasl. Fasl is the Arabic word for chapter or section, okay? But written in Hebrew characters. And then we have the report of somebody, an anonymous report of somebody who visited the home of Maimonides, right? Absolutely beautiful. It describes what it was like in the home. I don't care about his philosophy and his Code of Jewish Law. I want to know what they serve guests in the home. Okay? Lemon cakes, okay? Almost undoubtedly Mrs. Maimonides, we'll call her for lack of a better name. But there you have it. Okay, now we know what they served, lemon cakes. May I remind you that lemons are not native to the Middle East, right? Lemons are native to East Asia. But by this point, the citrus fruit, lemons, oranges, and so on have made their way across Asia into Egypt. He wrote a treatise on sexual intercourse because he is the physician to the court. By this point, during his lifetime, the Fatimid dynasty came to an end. They were replaced in Egypt by the Ayyubid dynasty, which was founded by the famous Saladin, who defeated the Crusaders in the Holy Land. And Maimonides was treating a member of the royal family who had trouble holding an erection, and therefore he had to write him a treatise, this is it, on what to do warming the genitals, taking this, taking that, and so on to strengthen the erection. My students in class can't believe they're hearing this in a classroom in an American university, but this is what we talk about. And of course, I love this, right? He tells you to take some carnation and some lemon peel, and you mix it with 2 rittles of wine, that's a measurement, or a rittle of honey for one who does not consider wine permissible. His patient is a Muslim, right? So he has to give you options for a Muslim patient versus a Jewish or Christian patient. This is an Arabic work that Maimonides owned, right? If you're going to be a physician, you have to know about plants and what plants can be used for cures. And how do we know Maimonides owned it? Because if you turn it over, it says simply Moshe. That's his name in his handwriting. You write your name in the front of your books, right? It's the same kind of thing that you have here. Okay. How are we doing on time? Okay, we'll get there. We never knew the following. The Cairo Geniza revealed this to us. We have 500, exclamation mark, 500 documents out of the 300,000, or out of the 30,000 that are non-sacred, tell us about the trade of Jewish traders, often with Muslim business partners, to India, across the Indian Ocean. These are some of these documents. Now, here's the map. You sail on the Red Sea, and about halfway between Egypt and India, you come to the port of Aden. It's the only real natural port in South Arabia, modern-day Yemen. And then you sail across, hugging the coastline, if you will, until you reach the Malabar coast of India. You could do this journey a little more dangerous, of course, shorter but more dangerous. These are the places that are mentioned in these documents. In a storeroom in a Cairo synagogue, they are talking about trading with India, right? They stop in Yemen, and then they go off to India as well. What are they trading? All of this has illuminated medieval commerce for us in ways we never knew. I showed you Maimonides, that's the Cordoba part. Now we come to the cardamon part. What are they exporting to India? On their ships going to India, they're taking paper and cheese and sugar, raisins, right? There are no grapes in India, but there are grapes in the Middle East. Wheat, sorghum, olive oil. There's no olives in India, but there's olives in the Mediterranean. Everybody getting this? This is trade. Flaxseed, linseed oil, and so on. And all these other things. What are they bringing back? Spices, right? Pepper, cinnamon, cardamom, turmeric, cloves, ginger, mace, nutmeg. I live in central New Jersey, which is the headquarters of the Indian immigrant community in the United States. We have Indian markets everywhere in our neighborhood, and that's where we go and buy our spices today. I tell my students, pepper and turmeric doesn't come in a little McCormick's shaker, okay? It comes from India, where they have spice plantations still today. And this is where you get nutmeg. And you're going to get some silk. Not that they went to China, but Chinese merchants had come to India. So when the Jewish Egyptian merchants go to India, they pick up silk and Chinese porcelain, right? Because this is what you can get when you are in India. You think you live in a globalized commercial society today? 1,000 years ago, they were already doing it. Right? And as long as we're in Aden for our rest break, we might as well pick up myrrh and frankincense, which grows only in South Arabia, and some African ivory. We're all sensitive to that today, of course, and so on and so forth. So there's the map. How are you going to do all this? How are you going to conduct this business? You're not going to carry with you all of your money, your gold and your silver in a pouch. Who's out there in the Indian Ocean? This is the audience participation part of our program. Right? You got pirates out there. Checks. These are the oldest checks in the history of the world. They figured out, right, that you didn't have to carry all your cash. You could have checks and money orders. Exactly what the difference is between checks and money orders, not being a specialist in medieval economy, I don't know. but again, I have colleagues who work on on this material. These all come from the same trader, a man named Abu Zikri Kohen, a Jew. There you have it. If you can read Hebrew, you can see his name. He signs the checks, okay? Nothing's changed. Well, actually, things have changed. No one writes a check anymore. It's all online banking, but you get the point, okay? All of these documents, of the circa 70 locations, first of all, let me show you this website. They're all aggregated now. Every single one of the 300,000 documents can be found at Geniza.org. And you can search and you can find whatever you want. You can search by library, you can search by text. If I want every single copy, because they're all cataloged, if I want every single copy of the book of Joshua chapter 5, I can search for it here. And trust me, I do that. Or my research assistant does it first for me, okay? Because they have learned how to negotiate this website. Where are the closest Cairo Geniza documents to Flint? Well, let's go to the pull-down menu and choose a library. Ann Arbor. How many of you knew that there were 3 Cairo Geniza documents in Ann Arbor? And you call yourselves Michigan fans, okay? All right? Okay. Rutgers is in the Big Ten now too, right? Okay. There you have it. In fact, alphabetical order. It's the first one on the list, okay? And here they are. These are the 3 documents which are in Michigan, in Ann Arbor. The one on the left and one on the right were things we always knew. The one in the middle was actually a new document. It's a poem with an anonymous author. We still don't know who wrote it. These were obtained by Francis Kelsey. You probably know the Kelsey Museum in Ann Arbor. These are in the university library, but they were obtained by Mr. Kelsey. But there's another Michigan collection. Charles Freer, does the name still resonate in the state of Michigan? The Freer Gallery at the Smithsonian, he obtained 50 documents early on from antiquities dealers, and they're all now in the Smithsonian, okay, Charles Freer. And I always just like to show this one. This is a letter. Here's the actual letter. This is a letter that was sent from Alexandria to Cairo in such and such a year. Not a very long distance, but somebody had to send a letter. And it says there, Mi Iskandaria. That's exactly how you say Alexandria in Arabic down to the present day. There's Charles Freer and his home in Detroit. So yes, Michigan connections to the Cairo Geniza collection as well. And there I am, March 2017, studying those documents. Again, they're all at Geniza.org, but this is what we do. We go to libraries, we study the documents, we look at them. You have to do both. You can zoom in on a digital photograph, but you actually have to see it and hold it and get the tactile and sometimes the olfactory sense as well. We end with this. Another thing that we never knew, another person that we never knew. In all of Jewish history, we never knew of this individual. We know about him only because of the Cairo Geniza discoveries. Let me introduce you to Johannes. He was a Catholic monk born in southern Italy around the year 1070. He converted to Judaism in the year 1102. Most people think that Jewish, Christian, and Muslim communities were insular and they didn't interface. We have all sorts of conversions between and among all 3 groups in all the different directions. In Spain, in Italy, in Egypt, everywhere, okay? Johannes converts to Judaism in 1102. And he finds it wise, correctly so, to leave the Christian world, or certainly the Catholic world, and eventually the Christian world, and to travel and live amongst Muslims where the Jews were tolerated much more so than they were in Christian Europe. And so he sets off, he changes his name to Obadiah, good Hebrew name, Ovadia, And he travels in Iraq and in Syria and in Israel. And then he settles in Cairo, in Fustat. We know all this because he wrote a memoir. He wrote a memoir in Hebrew, exquisite Hebrew. He mastered Hebrew. It's in his own handwriting. And here are the documents. And he explains everything: his upbringing, his becoming a priest, his conversion to Judaism, his travels, whom he meets, where he goes. And the 14 pages of the memoir are once again distributed in 3 different museums. It's the same libraries. It's the same text. It's the same composition. But scholars working in Budapest, Cambridge, and New York all uncovered documents over the course of the last 100 years. And so what did Gary Rendsburg do? Again, he created, with yet another one of my honors students, another digital humanities project where all of the material has been aggregated in a single website. It's more than just the memoir, which of course tells us his life. He wrote a prayer book for himself. Unfortunately, we only have the opening page. It's now in Cincinnati. And he set Hebrew prayers, you're all seated, right? He set Hebrew prayers to Gregorian chant, the musical traditions of his youth. And we found those in the Cairo Geniza in Egypt. A man who traveled from Italy throughout the Middle East, and he wound up in Egypt. And these are the Hebrew lyrics based on a verse in Jeremiah, and this is the musical notation, which I cannot read, but specialists can read anything, and specialists in Gregorian chant have studied this, and in fact, it has been recorded. Let's listen to a bit and follow my bouncing ball. Beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. And we knew none of this before the discoveries of the Cairo Geniza. And it has taken more than a century, it's now 120, 125 years, to figure everything out that I have provided for you this evening. And I've only dented the surface. We could study this for, I could give another, I'm not exaggerating, 5 or 10 lectures, and we still wouldn't capture everything. But this survey has hopefully given you an introduction into the amazing world of the Cairo Geniza. I end, before the Q&A, Toda, shukran.